Good evening, everyone. Welcome. I am David, and I'm a bookseller at Literati. We are pleased to welcome Julia Argy to our At Home at Literati series in support of The One. She'll be joined in conversation with author Julie Buntin. Now, just a quick webinar overview for all of our attendees. The chat is closed, but you can keep that chat window open as I'll be dropping links to purchase the book from Literati throughout the event. Q&A is accessible, so please submit your questions, as some of you have already done. Live transcription is available on your toolbar as well. And if you're watching us later on YouTube, links to purchase the books are in the description. You can also shop for more books at literatibookstore.com to have shipped to your home anywhere in the United States. And if you live in Southeastern Michigan, our doors are open to the public for in-store shopping. Most of all, we'd like to thank you for your attendance this evening, morning, afternoon, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for being here. And now allow me to introduce tonight's author and our moderator. Julia Argy received her MFA in fiction from the Helen Zell Writers Program at the University of Michigan in 2021. Before that, she graduated from Harvard University with a degree in statistics. She lives in Massachusetts. Julie Buntin grew up in Northern Michigan. Her debut novel, Marlena, was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle's John Leonard Prize, translated into 10 languages, and named a Best Book of the Year by over a dozen outlets, including the Washington Post, NPR, and Kirkus Reviews. Her writing has appeared in The Atlantic, Vogue, the New York Times Book Review, Guernica, and elsewhere. Her novel In Progress won the Ellen Levine Fund for Writers Award, and she teaches creative writing at the University of Michigan. And now I will hand it over to you both, and I'll be back shortly.
Thank you.
Thanks. Julia, congratulations here at the first event for your beautiful, wonderful, brilliant novel, The One, which hopefully everybody in the chat is, if you do not already own a copy, you're going to whatever clickable link Literati has provided to order your copy right now. So Julia, I'm really excited to talk to you about this, but I think the place to start is for you to read a little bit of the book to us so we can get a sense of the story, and then we'll launch into questions.
Great. Yeah, I'm just going to read right from the beginning, the first couple of pages. Okay. Night 1. Miranda wants me to act like I'm about to meet my husband. She says I should walk toward him like I'm walking down the aisle. Through the dark tinted window of the limousine, Dylan looks like the model in a Folgers commercial. So blandly hot that he could be anyone's husband, which is exactly why he was picked for the role. Miranda starts counting down for the woman across from me to exit the car first. The next time she gets to 1, it will be my turn. I'll step out of the limo and make my debut on national television. The first woman seems composed as she greets him, her cornflower blue silk dress flowing over her thin frame, and her skin like the skin of a regal baby in a painting. They hug, talk back and forth a bit, laugh, and hug again. I want him to look at me the way he's looking at her already, his eyes crinkling at the edges with a smile. I can be desirable if I try hard enough. In my regular life, I do it all the time, pouting about the heat so my downstairs neighbor will install my window AC unit for me, laughing too hard at barely a joke from a man on the phone to get a discount on my renter's insurance. It's never come naturally to me, not that it needs to. I learned how the world works by being a quick study. When the tall double doors of the mansion close behind the first woman, Miranda starts counting down again. On the ride over, all of us took tequila shots. I sweated through each curve of the desert road, up the scrubby hills towards my potential future husband. We bit down on pristine wedges of lime from the mini fridge, careful not to smudge our lipstick on the rinds, and then we screamed. I tried not to think about what I was getting myself into. Earlier today, when I modeled different outfits for Miranda, she said it was an asset that I had never watched the show. What's he going to be like? I asked her for what felt like the 100th time. I was in a ribbed butter yellow dress, so cheaply made that it pilled beneath my armpits within 15 minutes of wear, as though it was only ever supposed to be looked at and never used. Tall, Miranda said. I spun and Miranda shook her head no, detailing the dress. Stop overthinking. He's going to like you. And if he doesn't, then eventually you'll go home, and then 3 months from now, you'll see yourself on TV and think, my whole life is different, better. Thanks, Miranda. Trust me, she said. I do trust you, I said. good. You'll need to.
Great. Thanks, Julia. That was such a perfect opening note for the conversation. So I think it's kind of funny that some people who were here early heard our behind the scenes like meeting prep. Considering this is a book that is one of the deep pleasures of this book is reading all the behind the scenes stuff about the TV show that is a sort of setting of the story. So it's kind of like a fun little thing, but I'm hoping that maybe to kick things off, you can talk to us a little bit about where the one started for you. Just kind of like, what was your initial sort of impulse to write it, and kind of how did it first sort of take shape in your imagination?
Sure. So timeline-wise, it started in a thesis workshop. No, a regular workshop I was in with you. Mm-hmm. So you were there in the very early days of this. But I started writing it during the pandemic when I was watching a lot of reality television, mostly dating shows, The Bachelor, Love Island UK, Love is Blind. You know, those I think are the major three, at least in my consciousness, and definitely were at that time. And so I was both working on this problem of having to write. I knew I wanted to write a novel, so had to write a novel, needed an idea, and was just being inundated in my personal life and free time with all of this reality television content. And this was intersecting with some ideas I was thinking through in my own writing about technology and privacy and performance. And I felt like there was a certain point when I realized not only is reality television really fun to watch, it's also a very interesting cultural phenomenon that could kind of attack the ideas that I was grappling in my fiction. It felt like a really nice symbiosis. It also, on a craft level, like a novel can be anything. It can take place over years, both writing and setting wise. It can have any number of characters. And I felt a lot of comfort for this being my first book. I had never written anything maybe over 25 pages before, being like, it's set over 10 weeks. There are this many characters. And I didn't have to do that, you know, multi-generational family story across continents thing where the scope is so kind of scary. This felt like a really closed setting, which is also something that's very interesting about the shows themselves, is that they're super isolated and claustrophobic. So it was good for me on a craft level and for an interesting way to put my characters in kind of tricky, juicy situations.
Yeah, I love that answer. And it's true that again, kind of, I mentioned this already, but one of the great pleasures of this book is like, if you do watch the show, which I, for many years also did, though, since I had a child, I just never watched it again, which I think is true for you too, right? You don't watch it anymore either?
Yes. But I wrote this book and had a child. And so I think it was like a joint collaboration that I was like, I can no longer be watching so much of this show or these shows in general.
I have to say, I've always admired like you get this is getting away from the question a little bit, but you get this sinking feeling when you watch one of these shows, especially The Bachelor, right, where it's like 2 hours that stretch across like an entire Wednesday night. And sometimes there are like extra episodes and you're like, wait, am I spending 4 hours a week watching this? And I think most of us just feel like we've wasted our lives, but you made this like incredible piece of art out of that experience, which just continues to blow my mind. But okay, so I really liked your response, especially that part about creating a kind of set of boundaries or like a container for the story. And one thing that I love about the book is that, for those of you who haven't read it, that countdown or that structure is really sort of inherent to how you move through the story. So you can see like week 1 is sort of, we move progressively through the weeks, and there's a sort of sense of like tension and momentum that comes along with that, because even if you don't know the world of the show, you kind of know some of those patterns. And yet you also find interesting ways, and I'm going to attempt to do this whole interview without any spoilers, which may be hard, ways of sort of interrupting or like playing with that structure. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that, like sort of fun space you must have entered into as a fiction writer of like, here's a blueprint for something that's in the real world, but now as a novelist, you get to sort of put your own spin on it. So sort of how did that start to manifest for you as you worked on the book, and did things surprise you or change or?
Yeah, I don't know if I have full this, Julie, but the original idea I had for this book, which was really terrible, and I'm so glad that it's not in the printed copy that we have, was that the novel focuses on Emily, who's the main character, and she's a contestant. And then there are short interstitial chapters from the perspective of her producer that kind of dive deeper into the behind the scenes. And I think probably in an early draft that you read, it was not all from Miranda's point of view. It was different people behind the scenes. But the very original kernel of the idea was, what if every other chapter was a transcript of the episode of the show, which would have been so boring and so long. It would have been like 500,000 words this book, which is so kind of tedious. And I realized part of what I was interested in writing a book about reality television was that the book should offer something that watching the shows doesn't offer. Because at that point, people should just watch the television shows. And so that's where I started to make that departure, was thinking about, what can a book offer that these television shows can't? And the transcripts were Nick. And I started to move more into this character-based understanding of how I wanted the show to operate. And I think in terms of how time works in the book itself, the show that we see is so condensed and edited. And from the research I had been doing through watching the shows, but also I listened to some behind the scenes podcasts and interviews with people who had been on shows like this, the days last forever. You're bored 95% of the time. And then there are these really explosive moments, and the explosive moments are what you see on TV. But the book tries to capture everything else, the quote unquote, like real life that is going on for all of these people every moment. The contestants are also often very sleep deprived, and that's another thing they have to contend with. And so there's a lot of kind of time warps in the novel where Emily feels really disoriented to what's going on. Every day seems kind of the same, but also the pressures on her are increasing. And I think that is part of the like propulsive momentum for the plot, is this sense of like, not supernatural, but like there's the high like psychological intensity of being in a closed space like that. Is something I really want to focus on, that what we perceive as reality TV viewers is totally absent.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. And I'm thinking of like how well you sort of harness that by having the pressure of the show sort of like always pushing on the scenes. And yet there are these times that might otherwise sort of be, that have this like weird tension because of that. Like I'm thinking of, there's such a funny detail when Emily's like exercising and she passes some other people who are exercising, and one of them is like holding a vase. And it's like these moments that get kind of like heightened, sort of almost surreal treatment because this container is so weird. Even boredom has this like other purpose or something. It's really interesting. I want to go back to something else that kind of cropped up in your response, which is when you were kind of outlining how the story works, you mentioned sort of the two principal characters. We've got Emily, our point of view character, our protagonist, and we've got Miranda, her producer, who gets her own point of view sections. And this is kind of like a twofold question, I guess. I did see an earlier draft of this book where those interrupting chapters looked really different. And some of them were, if it's okay to talk about it, so I totally understand if you don't want to talk about an earlier book, draft of the book, but like some of them were like, I recall like blog posts from like, the world of Bachelor commenters, that kind of feeling of that sort of thing, or podcasts. Why did you zero in on Miranda as a specific sort of counterpoint to Emily's story? Like, what did that offer for you that you weren't able to get at as precisely without having her have her own sort of fully developed arc in the narrative?
Yeah, that's such a good question. There's a couple of reasons why. One of them, I'll start with the most boring reason, is when I was working with what Julie mentioned, like the podcast episodes and blog posts, there was this temporal issue where some of those things were happening after the show was aired. And so they were only seeing the edited version the reader of the book was only reading the live, real-time version of things. And everything that happened between then was kind of lost in translation. And so it started to read really weird, where you were like, I don't really know what this blog post person actually saw and what they're commenting on. Is that the same thing that we're commenting, that Emily is perceiving in her chapters? And the second reason, which was the more big picture, is I realized the ideas that I was interested in exploring with those chapters. Emily is, her perspective is in first person, present tense. It's very claustrophobic, like the show is very claustrophobic. And I knew I kind of needed to have the book break out from that from time to time. And so I wanted to make sure that we had that space to do that. And I realized those kind of things I could all answer with Miranda's point of view. And I also had fun with Miranda's point of view for doing the like kind of more juicy behind the scenes drama, which Emily is totally unaware of, at least at the beginning of the book. And so it starts with Miranda having all of this power and knowledge. She's worked on the show for a long time as a producer. Emily, as I read, has never really watched the show. And then over the course of the novel, that starts to shift. Emily gets a sense of the way that she's being manipulated. And then you get the sense that Miranda isn't necessarily acting like totally independently of the show, and she's as wrapped up in it as Emily is. And those seem like really fitting storylines to start to interweave together, as opposed to kind of like a mishmash of like fun behind the scenes stuff. It seemed to make more sense as a more cohesive narrative.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And I think another thing that really struck me about the two of them together, it was fun to see that sort of settle in as the choice of the book when I read the final draft. Like it does this interesting thing too, because Emily is so much of Emily's story feels like it's about this question of like, who am I when people aren't looking, or like who is the real me versus the screen me, or like, what do I actually want? And do I want what people tell me I want? And what is the real thing that's actually mine? And then we have Miranda, who's like this fiercely ambitious person with like a really clear sense of what she wants, who we see sort of hounded by the patriarchy in like different ways. So I find the friction between the two of them so compelling. And I guess I know I wonder if people heard this when we were talking before the event started, but I'm hoping you can actually read a little bit. There's this passage from Emily's perspective that I think is so characteristic of this like really interesting tension that the book captures around what it means to be sort of looked at, and how Emily processes that and how it sort of steers the story. It is on 122, and it starts with, "I promise I'll make it good for you." And then maybe you could just read like about a page through the next page. I think maybe I decide I'll still eat the toast is a good place to stop. And then maybe if you could talk a little bit about like sort of thinking about that quality of Emily's character and what you're trying to say about sort of the positions she's in at that moment in the story.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. Okay. I promise I'll make it good for you, he says. His laugh rings down the hallway as I walk to the kitchen, and I bristle. I make toast from the butt ends of a sourdough loaf. Only half the girls in the house eat gluten, so there's usually some lingering pastry in the communal food pantry. The rising sun streams through the huge windows, and the rays warm my face. I can picture my eyelashes sparkling in the light, casting my features in a golden glow like a filter. I shake my hair out a bit, the ends of it dusting across my shoulders. My top lip is fuller than my bottom one naturally, a desirable trait these days. I arch my back against the counter, letting my nipples push against my thin sweater. If this was the morning after I slept with someone, the man could come downstairs and see me like this, young and lithe and bathed in light. I wouldn't notice him, caught up in my own moment, and I would look beautiful, so natural and unencumbered that he would have to fall in love with me. The toast stings, and I'm jolted from my daydreaming. When I go to grab the slice, it burns me and falls through my fingers, sliding under the gap between the dishwasher and the floor. I reach down on all fours to grab it and come across a spread of lost Cheerios, chopped pecans, and other shriveled food scraps. I'm surprised the house isn't infested with rats at this point. As I stand, I notice a camera pinned in the corner of the room, high on the wall by a hanging three-dimensional sculpture of sound waves. I stare at it for a moment too long, watching it watch me. This is what I have felt throughout my life, that someone could be watching me and that each moment is an opportunity for me to be desired. I could be walking to work in a crush of people in winter, all disguised in scarves and hats, and feel a pair of eyes gaze down on me from above, telling me to be beautiful, telling me that if I only tried hard enough and was vigilant enough, someone could fall in love with me that moment. I decide I'll still eat the toast.
Great. Thanks, Julia. Ooh, I love that passage. I love how it like pulls on sort of all the threads of this sort of complicated situation that Emily's in, where she's both she has to present something, she has to figure out who she is. But yeah, I'm just wondering if you can talk a little bit about that moment and coming to that part of her character.
Yeah. In terms of my writing process, I didn't write this book chronologically, and that was one of the first passages that I had written. So you're very tuned in, Julie. You're such a good reader. So that was definitely kind of forefront of my mind, and part of the reason I chose this reality show as a setting, because I was feeling and noticing that in day-to-day life, with the ubiquity of social media, there seemed to be this idea that, you know, every opportunity could be like a very nice picture for Instagram, or like, you know, video for TikTok, whatever it may be, that existing was somehow an opportunity for like consumable culture to present to others. And reality TV is that dialed to 100, where they're totally being videotaped all the time, and it's under the it's with the goal that someone would fall in love with them. And so turning that dial up on that pressure, where it's not kind of an imagined situation, it's like a genuinely real situation that Emily is encountering, was really kind of a central idea that I wanted to focus on in the novel. And a lot of Emily's malleability as a character and like stress about her day-to-day life comes from the fact that she's so focused on that she has no concept of existing as a person as herself. And throughout the course of the novel, that is one of the things that she has to contend with, is like, what does this reality TV mindset do to someone's psyche, when obviously major dose of it while she's on the one, but also this is something that she had been dealing with before she got on the show, and has only been, you know, more difficult to contend with while she's there, and more consuming of her thoughts.
Yeah, it really does. I think you put that so beautifully. Like it does, it's a moment that really, you know, as someone who grew up like sort of maybe like one of the last generations, like not fully online from like the first moment of my life, but like most of my life I've been online in some way or another, right? Like it feels like it really like starts to perfectly kind of triangulate how weird it is to know that a certain part of your existence means like performing some element of your personality, but everything heightened times 1,000 because it's in the context of the show. But that does make me think, you don't actually, are you on social media?
Newly on Instagram. Follow me, Julie Argy. I got it for my book release. But when I wrote this book, and for a long time, not really engaged in any social media, I think part of the reason for that was because I think I'm like extra sensitive to this anxiety of feeling like, you know, like I don't want to be eating a nice breakfast sandwich and then being like, I should really show people I'm eating this really nice breakfast sandwich. That seems like I just don't want my thoughts to go there. So for a long time I was not, but newly on it. I have 5 posts.
Oh, cool. But it's interesting though, that even though you weren't like sort of like spending your adulthood fracturing your identity in 700 million directions for public consumption via Instagram or Facebook or Twitter, that it still kind of creeped its way into your sense of like how we have to live in the world, and how you sort of like approach this story and thought about writing this narrative. But to move into sort of another question. So another interesting point of like contrast in the story that I was fascinated by is a sort of tension between like the private world of women and women, the performed world of the women in the house. So like there's like a space in the mansion where there are no cameras, and we see them in these kind of like intimate moments together. There's a wonderful pimple popping scene that's like really great. And I'm curious about how you thought about sort of those off-screen spaces and what you could do in those spaces as a writer that you couldn't do in the other areas of the book to sort of show us a fully dimensional portrait of these women who were sort of compromised by always being on screen or something.
Yeah, there's a lot of scenes that take place in a bathroom, just because those are the rooms that are not filmed in the mansion for the one. And so there's like more scenes than necessary that just happen in a bathroom so that they can have some privacy. And I think part of the weirdness around reality television is this idea that the drama is a real source of entertainment for people, and that is a reason people like to watch. There's often like kind of two ends of the spectrum. Like, I really like watching people find love, or like I really like watching people get into interpersonal conflict. And you can kind of, I think, fall anywhere along the lines of that. And so in terms of the interpersonal conflict, you know, there's no privacy. You're stuck with these strangers all day long, and you're in a somewhat competitive environment. So of course there's going to be interpersonal conflict that would happen to anyone. I'm thinking back to just, you know, living in a dorm or something, which is like a way lower stakes. It's like everyone has problems with everyone. That's just like part of being a person in the world. And the parts that get aired are the parts that are dramatic. But for the most part, it's just people like with really nothing to do with hanging out together. And those moments in private are a real way for the women to unwind fully, and we get a sense of their personalities that's totally outside of the, you know, you don't have to be with people who you're feeling tense with. You don't have to, you know, worry your conversation is going to get aired at some point. And so those are the moments, I think, where I was able to do the most kind of character work, where it was like they were able to meet outside of the show in a certain way, and just quote unquote be themselves, which I think is like a question in the book, is what that actually means. But they're kind of able to interact on a level more stress-free playing field. And that is why quite a few of those private moments crop up, because it's I think for the reader too, it's just a sense of reprieve from the constant inundation of cameras and audio, etc.
Yeah, it feels like in a way they're like the secret, it's like the secret world of the book where like the secret story is happening or something. And there's something so nice about kind of moving between those worlds as a reader. Like one storyline progresses in the world of the one, and then kind of behind the closed doors or in these like niche secret zones, there's other relationships developing and things kind of coming to the fore that will complicate that other world of the book. So I really loved how that worked. And I also just felt like there was something really nice here too, in thinking, going back to something you said earlier in our conversation about wanting to do something with the book that couldn't be done from like watching the show. There's a way, right, that like I don't know if people ever said this to you when you were watching The Bachelor, but something that sort of like traveled around my friend group of people who watched the show was like that it was so much more fun to watch The Bachelor versus The Bachelorette, because it was more fun to watch a group of women than a group of men. And then the sort of like suggestion around that was that the women were like bitchier or like cattier, or there was more of that interpersonal conflict. And there's something interesting that you're doing with this book where you're kind of like thumbing your nose at that, because there's a lot of like tenderness and real connection between the women that develops over the course of the show. So I'm wondering if you were thinking about that at all too, when you were kind of writing into those scenes that are just them away from Dylan, who's the contestant, and kind of away from the producers.
Yeah, so I, for different reasons, have always liked watching The Bachelor more than The Bachelorette, but it's because I find The Bachelorette to be too good at her job, where it just becomes so clear so early she knows who she's going to end up with. And it's like, and she handles, the women often handle the interpersonal conflict between the men better. Whereas there have been seasons of The Bachelor where you're watching this man like go back and forth between 5 women, just totally bungling the whole scenario. And like that is, I think, more entertaining. I don't think it's necessarily because the women are cattier. It's because the men like don't really know how to navigate a lot of the conflict that's going on the show. And so I agree, but for somewhat different reasons. I like to feel like maybe other people have a chance at getting engaged at the end, and on The Bachelorette that becomes very clear that there's a favorite. But in terms of your question, from the research I was doing, I heard a lot of people talk about the fact that, you will get into conflicts with these people and then have to, spend 6 hours on a bus ride with them the next day. And so everything that's cut out is the interesting stuff of being a person in the world and having to like reconcile differences, agree to disagree, make amends, stuff like that. And that, I think, was more interesting to me to think about what it would be like to, get in a fight with someone and then, make up, as opposed to what the show portrays, which is, there are villains and there are bullies and there are people who fight them and there are these camps and they're very separate. I think they're obviously, as in life, the rooming group that Emily's in becomes very close and they are a friend group, but there's not this kind of constant animosity with other people that the show itself kind of wants you to believe in. And it would also be unsustainable for the show to act like, if there were that much drama, the show, we are already wasting 4 hours a week on this. Like, the show it would be like, 12 hours a week of conflict.
Yeah.
But for the most part, it seems like, and as I portrayed in the book, a lot of it is just more low-key, laid back, waiting. Yeah. And that psychological stress is almost worse for the women than it is to be fighting with each other, because there's really nothing to do except think about whether or not you're going to marry the lead.
Yeah.
Like, the fighting is almost a reprieve from that line of thinking. Like, at least you have something else to do.
Yeah, it's right. And also too, like the edit, right? Like, and that's handled so well here too, like this idea, this reminder as you read a novel like this that really takes you into this world, even in a fictionalized way, that like what you saw in that show, no matter how much you bought into the story, was constructed for you to have a specific kind of response to what it is that you saw. You made reference a couple of times to your research and writing the book, and I know we've sort of circled it, but I'd love to like hear a little bit more about what you did to kind of learn so much. I mean, there's a lot of little things in here that are so satisfying. Like, maybe it's not even true, but there's that. But it must be where they advise Emily like not to eat the food on the first date because the sound of the chewing would be too gross during, like, it would be picked up on the mics, like things like that. Just I mean, perhaps he made it up, but it feels like it must be from like the world of this show. So I guess I'm curious, like, I know you watched a lot of the show, which was probably first line of research, but like, what else did you do? Like, were there texts that you read? Did you interview people? Did you go anywhere? What was like maybe the most helpful, sort of surprising insight into what would become the world of the one?
Yeah, so I didn't interview anyone, didn't go anywhere, did all this from the comfort of my own home.
I guess it was like COVID times too, so.
It was majorly COVID when I was working on this. But So watching the show for a long time, feeling like I had started to get an understanding of the storylines. You start to watch something for so long and you think, oh, it's the same thing for reading books. It's like, oh, I've read this type of book before. I have a sense of where this is going. So I kind of came into writing it with the baseline knowledge of that. And then in terms of research, I would, there were a couple of blogs and podcasts that were really interested in behind the scenes. The food detail is real, and it's because it's like old. It's not old. It's just like hours. It's not warm food. It's not like you're getting served at a restaurant and your waitress brings something out. It's like you arrive like in the middle of the night somewhere and there's like a cold chicken cutlet on your plate, and it's like, don't eat that. You have to eat something else, something different. But the most interesting thing that I learned about was Frankenbiting, which is, I think most people, do you know what this is? Okay, this is when they Frankenstein together in post-production quotes that people really never said at all. Like one word from every sentence over the course of the season. And you can basically be made to say anything. And I got a hand somehow on a Bachelor contract that has a clause in it that's like, we can air you saying things that you never said at all. And you're like, yes, please, like, da 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 da. And so they really can invent things from scratch. And there was one podcast, there was one blog from Charlene Joint, who was on
I remember
Pablo's season.
Charlene was classy. Charlene was...
Yes, so Charlene was identifying in GIFs moments that were Frankenbitten and like showing where the cuts were as though they were like poetry lines. And now I can hear the like weird audio when I watch other TV that's spliced together, because I spent so much time. Yeah, and that's a really transferable skill. So if anyone needs me to tell you what audio is fake and real,
wow,
I have done my hours of research to try to figure that out.
Oh my God, that's so interesting and so like chilling and upsetting. In a weird way, that reminds me, it isn't really connected, but for some reason it reminds me of another choice that you made here that I've always found really fascinating and smart, which is that Emily, our lead, our star, she did not audition for the show. She doesn't exactly know what it is when she comes into it, or she kind of knows the way that we all sort of know, right? And I think you talking about Frankenbiting reminds me of that, because it just seems like extra unsettling or something, that she would be in a situation where she could be molded into anything, and also is coming in with like very little like sort of intention or like goal. She like just doesn't really know what she's getting into. And so I guess I'm curious if you can talk about that a little bit. Like, did you always see her as this kind of character who finds herself a little bit in the middle of this world that she's not fully like informed about, the way that some of her, she's getting advice from castmates who like really, really know, right? Who like watched it all. Why was that important to sort of like lean into with Emily?
Yeah, I always didn't want her to be the expert. I was like, okay, I'm trying to be an expert here. Like Miranda's an expert. She's like, there's only so many people you can have like totally know how to game the show. Like then what would happen? Like I have no idea how I would have plotted that out. So I always knew she would have to be kind of on the fresher side of being exposed to television shows like this. And it's part of my interest in these shows is what type of person goes on these shows, and why would you do it? Because it's so high risk, high reward, increasingly so in terms of reward now that you can leave and have a really robust social media following that can like give you six figures for years to come in terms of income. But also high risk in terms of what I just said, where it's like you can be made to say anything, like your producers are kind of in charge of the direction that goes, and you're at their whim. So yes, you have quote unquote free will, but you also they have a lot of power to manipulate you kind of in real time, and also Emily increasingly starts thinking about how they have powers to manipulate her life afterwards and what her decisions on the show could potentially cost her once that leaves. And so I always knew that that is something I wanted her to kind of start to learn about as she was on the show, rather than be one of the people who joined the show as a like future budding influencer, of which I think today most people who join reality shows are like, this is going to be great for my modeling career, and it's going to really jumpstart my TikTok following. And so I didn't want Emily to be that wise to the like performance element of it all. I wanted her to be a little more raw.
Yeah, it's also too just like that great thing in a novel, right, where you have someone in a system that you need to tell the reader a lot of things about, but they don't know, they're not already informed, right? So like the way that other characters tell them and the way they're sort of taught how it all works also gets to be the way the reader is like introduced to the world. So those two things are happening kind of at once in a way that feels really like natural and absorbing. It just struck me as such a smart decision. I see that David is back to grab questions from the audience, of which there are already many.
I
so
know.
but I have some more if we need, but we've got a lot here. So let's.
So first question is, what was your favorite part of the book to write?
That is a great question. I loved writing the aforementioned pimple popping scene. That was fun. I liked scenes where all of the characters could kind of get together. I feel like when people are stuck or when I'm stuck at least in my writing, I'm like, just shove them in a room together and see what happens. As a way to like get out of my and poor Emily's very claustrophobic head. And so that was fun. And I got the opportunity to kind of do that a lot in the book because there are so many group dates where the women are doing kooky things, sometimes in foreign countries, and get to kind of see them all interact. Those were probably the most fun to write. Thank you for asking.
And now the next question has to do with the manifesto from the Chapel Hill shooter and how that part of the book was poignant. This audience member found it interesting that Emily related to him and that she wanted to love and be loved. Do you think contestants in dating shows today should make commentary on hot topics in the US, or should they avoid them?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the book takes place in like a very contemporary version of a dating show. And I think as time has gone on, I've been watching these shows for a really long time. I've seen more that the shows, there was this kind of initial impression that the shows are making our culture somehow, that people were watching these shows by the millions and they were learning about how to find love in the real world. I think that was kind of the initial perception of what these shows were doing. And I see now that the shows are very responsive to the public, and that the conversations that happen on the shows are in some part, and I don't know, as I said, I've never been on one of these, but it seems to me kind of artificially inserted into a season based on kind of topics that the producers want to cover. And that is something that the book tackles, kind of among this thread of privacy and public performance. Is Emily ends up being tasked with like being the voice of contemporary feminism on the show, which she has no real like expertise in, and it's kind of just talking generally about. And so and that's pushed on her by Miranda, her producer. And so I've witnessed kind of uncomfortable, not like in terms of actually being like an uncomfortable conversation to have, but like the people having the conversations don't seem totally comfortable or organic in having them. They seem kind of artificially made. And part of the question I was thinking through as I was writing this is like, are those conversations helpful as a viewer? Are they helpful for the people talking about them? Like, what does the increasing integration of contemporary political dialogue into these shows, like doing to the show and to the contestants and the viewers. I don't think I came up with an answer. I think there are times when I've potentially been moved by what people say, but for the most part, I feel bad that they're put in this position to have to do a public performance about whatever, hot button topic that they're kind of tangentially through their family or through their personal life having experienced. It feels like they're put in a really challenging position and have to navigate that. And I think that's only become increasingly true as time has gone on in these shows, and the audience has become more engaged with the way that these shows are portraying love in our culture and are kind of speaking back to that.
Okay. I don't have anything to add to that. So that was wrapped up very nicely. Thank you for that. Despite the social nature of the show, the setting is actually quite isolated and isolating. Was this dichotomy something you were thinking about when you began writing the book?
Yeah, I think I was really interested in, there are two kind of aspects to reality television that I was interested in exploring as it being a setting for the novel. The one is that it's like inherently fun. Like, it's dramatic, it's juicy, there's love, etc. And then, so that's kind of what we see on television and the overarching thread of, our impressions of reality television. And then it's also a very interior, like introspective time for a lot of these characters, like a time out of time. They're not in their regular life. They have the opportunity to reflect a lot. They're, totally distanced from loved ones, the media, like anything. They're not allowed to read books. They're very, very isolated. And so in addition to it having all these fun plot elements to discuss big picture-wise, it also was great for a first-person narrator to be somewhere that's so intense and ruminative. Like that was really easy for me to have. She has so much free time. She's really thinking about how she wants her life to take shape. It was like a great way to both do like exterior scene and interior scene in the book.
Now, on a lighter note, who's the best bachelor of all time?
Oh, great question. Okay. I'm going to say my favorite Bachelor season, but I don't think it's going to be because I think he was a good Bachelor, but I loved Argy's season.
Wow.
That season, okay, listen to my reasoning. And then I'm going to make you answer, Julie.
Well,
okay.
it was a dramatic season.
Okay, so I'm going to spoil Argy's season. It's been out for like 10 years. So if you haven't seen it yet, you're just too late. Okay. It ends up, he proposes to a woman and then says, never mind, and goes with the second woman. They're still married and have a bunch of kids together. So like, it was a successful like romance, and I'm very happy for them. And it was very dramatic with the like bait and switch at the end. And then throughout it, there was a quote unquote villain who I found very entertaining, and who later, her name was Crystal, and she later joined Bachelor in Paradise, the spinoff show, and was totally likable and enjoyable. So it was both like showing how artificial the season, the like construction of the villain was, where I think she was probably kind of like interpersonally hard to deal with, but not actually like that malicious or evil. And then also had like a juicy end and also a romance. So I think it had everything. Do I think Argy like is that great? Like I can't say. I would guess like he's perfectly fine. So I don't know if he's my favorite as a person, but in terms of the season, that's my favorite. What's your answer, Julie?
I don't know. That was a very convincing answer, actually. I was remembering the like breakdown scene when Becca. I mean, it was just such a shit show. It was really fun to watch. So that is a really good answer. I mean, I remember, it's kind of hard for me to remember anything like pre my baby. I don't remember. So I'm kind of like, they're all the same. It was a bunch of like the same guys, but I do remember being quite entertained by Colton's really dramatic
Oh yeah.
thing when he like ran away because he like had to marry Cassie. I don't even
Mhm.
totally remember how it all went down, but Colton was like the most boring person of all time. So I don't know. Wait, who was your favorite Bachelorette though? Is that another
Uh,
question, David? I guess it's
No,
not.
but it can be.
It should be, right?
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, okay. And I have an answer for person is Rachel Lindsay, but she was so good at the show. That's what I'm saying. It's like she was so good at handling the show that it was less, there was no Ari mess.
Yeah, that's so true.
So, but I also loved Hannah Brown.
Oh yeah, that was so fun.
Which was really fun.
Yeah, that's a great answer. I mean, and Hannah was so awkward. I remember when she was selected, everyone was like, "Oh God, that girl." But then she like really kind of rose to the occasion in such an interesting way. Anyways, your audience has other questions, so I'll stop.
Yeah.
Yes, this next one is from someone who first wants you to know that they're loving the book and they're curious about your influences. Who are some of your favorite writers?
That's a great question. I love Susan Choi. I've read a bunch of her books and they're all super wonderful. I love Patricia Lockwood. Crushing poetry, fiction and nonfiction. Her memoir, Free Fatty, is one of my favorites. It's so funny. And I also love her other genres. Who else do I like? In terms of this book specifically, I was thinking a bit about some kind of contemporary debuts talking about like the role of young women in society, like Luster by Raven Leilani, Such a Fun Age by Kylie Reed, Happy Hour by Marlo Grados. Those were all kind of floating in the back of my mind as I was working on this book. Thank you.
And we are circling back to the dichotomy of drama / interiority that you mentioned. How did you work to balance satire with sincerity in writing about a very superficial setting while some people seem to be genuinely seeking love?
Yeah, I always knew I wanted someone to quote unquote be there for the right reasons. Like I wanted people to believe, and I think some people go on the show actually thinking maybe this will work out. I think I say something to this effect in the book, but if you go on 30 first dates and then you get engaged to someone that you met on one of those, like that's not that bad. Like that seems like a pretty reasonable success rate for a person to have a relationship with. And so going on the show with that perspective, being like, yeah, maybe this will work out for me, it seemed important to have like a bit of that energy. And I think Emily, in her like waffliness, is like kind of amenable to that idea that maybe this could work out for her, especially as it becomes, I don't think we've honestly mentioned Dylan's name in this, but poor Dylan is the lead. He doesn't get much time on the page, but as Dylan and Emily's relationship builds, she kind of warms to the idea that maybe this could be really good and right for her. And I think part of that is the intense pressure of the show and the pressure coming from Miranda to feel that way. But I think part of it is kind of this genuine hopefulness that through marrying Dylan, her life could kind of have a direction and a purpose that it currently lacks. And so I think that is like a sincere gesture on her part to take the process seriously. And then there are other people who are there to like go on a nice vacation and gain followers on social media and enjoy themselves greatly. And I think, like I was saying earlier, the most fun parts were the parts where all of those types of people were able to interact together. And I wanted there to be that kind of diversity of opinion and reasons about going onto the show so that it wasn't, like I was saying to you earlier, like everyone's an expert on the show and everyone's trying to game it. That seems like a boring book to write and would be. And I think it's kind of what is increasingly happening on the shows themselves as they get more like what's facing influencer recruitment platform. But I wanted it to be a bit more diverse than that in terms of the balance between sincerity and just kind of like having a good time and enjoying yourself.
That's so insightful. I think it's true, right? Like that the shows have sort of they seem to like be losing some of whatever that spark was in the earlier seasons, where it seemed like something that was truly unexpected could happen somehow. It's like because of Instagram and influencer culture, like that seems to be like over or something. I'm going to ask maybe one more question if that's okay, David, and then I think we might have time. But first, a reminder to you all that it's not too late to order the book from Literati Bookstore right now using, I believe there's a link in the chat. And also that, Julia, I think you have other events coming up soon, right? In New York?
Yeah, I'm going to be in New York tomorrow night at 7 p.m. at TNT Knitwear, and then Monday at Harvard Bookstore, also at 7 p.m. So if you are around in the area, I would love to see you in person. I will sign your book. I will do a bad sketch of something. If you request it, I would be very happy to see you there.
So before I let you go, I'm wondering what else you're working on. If you can give us like any teaser or not. Sometimes people get really superstitious about that. But yeah, I would just love to know.
Yes, I am at work on another book. It's a novel. I have like 60,000 words of it done. I'm not going to say what it's about because I'm too superstitious for that, but it is, I'm trying to write 500 words a day, which is how I wrote this book. It's literally like a grid I printed out with a bunch of boxes, and I get to color. It's like the gold star system of an elementary schooler. I get to color in my box every 500 words I write. And then at the end it says book is done. So beautiful. I'm about 3/4 of the way to book is done. And it is, I will say, it is not a Love Island book. It's not a sequel. I was always making that joke when I was writing this. I was like, and then the next book's going to be Love is Blind. The next book is going to be Love Island. I'm just going to keep going through all of but it's not. I've the questions I had about reality television and why we all watch these dating shows, I answered with this book. And so if you're confused too, you can buy it. You can read it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Julia. Congratulations. Yay.
Yeah, it's just about time to wrap up. So thank you, Julia and Julie, for being with us tonight. And thank you to our viewers as well. Make sure you buy the book. The link is in the chat on the event listing that brought you here. And of course, you can always come into our store where we'll have a lot of other recommendations for you. Thank you for your support, and we'll see you all at the next event.
Thank you, everyone.